Hello everyone, and welcome to the Asia launch of the OMFIF Gender Balance Index. My colleague Katu Sita and I from the research team at OMFIF will be going through the presentation of the findings with you, so we can be there with you in person, but we're very pleased to be partnering with Barings to be sharing the findings in Singapore as well. So what is the Gender Balance Index? Going through the first slide, you can see we've collected the database of over 6,000 individuals from over 400 institutions, so 173 central banks, 74 sovereign funds, so this is global coverage, and then European public pension funds. And this is all in the report that you will have on your seats to look at. So the Gender Balance Index tracks the presence of men and women in senior policy-making roles in these institutions. So we look on average at the 10 to 15 most senior people in each institution. And we give each institution a score. Each individual gets a different weight depending on the seniority. So in the case of central banks, for example, whether the governor is male or female will have a higher weight compared to deputy governor, and then monetary policy committees, financial policy committees, etc. So on average is the 10 to 15 most senior. And each institution gets a score between 0 and 100, where 100 means perfectly balanced. So if there's more men than women or more women than men, then you go below 100. We also prepare regional scores. So in the case of central banks, these are weighted by the GDP of the jurisdiction in which the central bank operates. And in the case of sovereign wealth funds and public pension funds, is weighted by the assets under management that these institutions have. So this is how the score is prepared. A question that we get very often when we prepare this index and when we present it is, why do we care about diversity? Why is OMFIF doing a report about gender diversity in policy-making institutions? And there's basically three reasons. The first is that diversity matters. It's not about gender, it's not a women's issue, it's about having diversity, and there's other types of diversity as well that if we have the time and the resources in future years, we'd like to look at that as well. We're focusing on gender right now. Having a different set of people that think differently. There is a lot of evidence, and policymakers that have written in the report themselves point out that this could have been one of the factors that contributed to the financial crisis, groupthink, the fact that individuals with similar backgrounds may think in a different way and respond to crisis, to issues that come up in similar ways, don't have that fresh perspective. So all types of diversity matter, and that's why we look at gender. There's a famous quote from Christine Lagarde saying that perhaps if it was the Lehman sisters instead of the Lehman brothers, we wouldn't have had the same situation. The second reason why we think diversity matters is because role models matter. So we're not going to get to a place where we have a diverse pool of people to choose from if that doesn't start early. And for young girls, for young women who go into economics, who go into careers in central banks, in sovereign funds, in pension funds, they need to have people that look and act and have similar backgrounds to them as role models, so that they can know that these careers are possible for them as well. It's about inspiring younger cohorts, more junior cohorts, to follow in the footsteps of these leaders. And there is, again, a lot of academic and empirical evidence showing that role models matter, that girls in school are more likely to choose economics as a career if they have had role models speak to them. So that's important. And the third reason is that the entire organization benefits from having a more diverse pool of talent to choose from. In the case of countries, for example, if you're not using half your population to their best skill, if they're not maximizing their potential, then you're missing out on potential talent. So it's a benefit to both women and men in these organizations that they can use everyone's skills to their maximum potential. So looking at the central bank results for the latest edition of the index. In the case of central banks, we have only 14 women in charge of the 173 central banks that we looked at. So that's 8%. It's a very, very small share. 14 out of 173. When we present this, people are very surprised. They think, well, central banks, public institutions, we thought they would be doing better, but they are doing worse than CEOs of the big companies, worse than parliaments. The stats are really bad, and that's why we do this report, because everyone knows that there is a situation of lack of diversity in policy making, but without having the numbers, you don't know exactly how bad. So 8% of governors. When we look at governors and deputy governors, this rises to 36%. So 63 out of the 173 institutions have either a governor or a deputy governor that is woman. And then when we extend it to all the individuals that we look at, so that's not the entire staff, but as I said before, on average is the 10 to 15 most senior people at each institution. So for central banks, 80% will have a woman at least at that level. So you think, oh, 80%, that's quite good. But what it means is that 20% have no women at all in very senior positions. So 1 in 5 central banks has no senior women at all in their very senior positions. Let that sink in for a minute. So it's something that we really have to work on in the case of central banks. So moving on to the next slide, you can see here the regional scores for how central banks are doing by region. So the average score, and remember what I said in the beginning, the perfect score is 100%. So 100% means perfectly balanced. It's not 50% is what we're looking for, it's 100%. So if you have more women than men, it's below 100% as well. In most cases, it's more men than women. But the average score globally is 25%. And that's up from last year. Last year when we measured this, it was 19%. So it's an improvement, but it's still very far from 100% where we would like to be. And when we look at the different regions, Europe and North America have the highest scores. So in the case of Europe, it's 38%. In the case of North America, it's 36%. And we'll go to show you some examples. Regions such as Asia Pacific are actually doing quite badly, 9% compared to 6%. And again, we'll show you some examples. But you can see here in that slide the regional distribution. Next slide, we see the top 20. So who is doing the best in that index? And we have Iceland at the top, a country that gets a score of 93%. Now, this is a very small country with a very small population. So you can see the argument that I mentioned in the beginning, why diversity matters. For a country that has anyway very few people, it wants to use them to their best talent. So it prioritizes diversity, and it has rules such as quotas to ensure that women progress in that field. Not for central banks, but more widely in the society. So we think that matters. We haven't really investigated that. And looking at Asian countries that do well in that index, in the top 20, we only have 4 Asia-Pacific countries. So we have Timor-Leste, Australia, the Maldives, and Fiji. So overall, we see that small island economies, like 3 of the 4 I mentioned here, tend to do quite well on the index. It's not just the Asia-Pacific ones. We also have countries from Africa, from the Caribbean, that tend to do well. We also have countries from the former Soviet Union that tend to do well and are in the top 20 as well. So there are some regional trends to see. And then in the next slide, you can see the monetary policy boards or the executive boards, the presidents from the world's biggest policy-making institutions, the most advanced central banks. So we have the Bank of Japan, the policy board, we have the executive board of the European Central Bank, we have the presidents of the regional federal reserves in the United States, and we also have the People's Bank of China. And we think pictures are powerful, so you can see here really the lack of diversity that we have in these really top levels of these 4 central banks that control the world economy. So in the case of the ECB, we have a little bit of an improvement there. Christine Lagarde appointed president in November, and Isabel Schnabel nominated to take posts on the executive board as well. That's why there is a question mark on the slide, or maybe by the time you're seeing this, there won't be anymore. But it's a slight improvement in the case of the ECB. And then to show you also, because we think pictures matter, role models matter, the 14 women that are in charge of central banks globally, 14 out of 173, and one of them is also the governor of the Central Bank of Malaysia. I'll hand over to my colleague Kat now to take you through Asia in a little bit more detail, and also the results for sovereign wealth funds and public pension funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Danai. So I thought we'd look more closely at the results for Southeast Asia. We are in Singapore after all. So in ASEAN right now, there's only one female central bank governor, and that's Governor Noor Shamsia, who is also the second woman to be appointed as governor of Bank Negara Malaysia. The first, of course, was former governor Zeti Aziz. Right now, Malaysia and Thailand are the only countries to have ever had a female central bank governor. But the good news is that out of the other Southeast Asian countries, 7 have female deputy governors. So even if there's not a lot of women at the very top, at least we see a pipeline of potential future governors in some of these ASEAN central banks. Looking more closely at Singapore, in the Monetary Authority of Singapore, they actually score quite well in our index. So it scores 28%, ranking 6th out of the 10 ASEAN central banks. There's still some room for improvement, but the management team is very diverse. Now, the problem with the MAS is that its all-male board is pulling down its score. Now, those are the results for central banks. Moving on now to sovereign funds. So, as you can see in this slide, the scores for sovereign funds is actually the lowest among the different types of institutions that we look at. So, last year it was 12%. This has gone up slightly to 17%, painting overall quite a good picture. However, you'll see large discrepancies between and among the regions. So, the lowest score for any region and any institution type that we look at in the index is that for the Middle East, where we've got a score of 2% for this year, which actually doubled from the year before, but that's because the score last year was very low at 1%. Now, looking again at Singaporean institutions, we have here the leadership teams of Temasek and GIC. So as you can see, they're actually quite diverse in the sense that there are several females represented in these management teams. However, similar to the MAS, their scores are pulled down by the fact that there are no or very few women in their board. So in the case of Temasek, there's only 1 female on the board, and in the case of GIC, there are none. Why is diversity particularly important when it comes to sovereign funds? Well, we think that sovereign funds are actually in a position to influence investment trends across the world, because after all, they are holders of some of the largest amounts of assets in the world. So you might have noticed that increasingly sovereign funds are taking ESG considerations in their investment choices, and we think that gender diversity should be part of that. Sovereign funds are in a position to actually influence listed companies, for example, to take gender diversity more seriously if they chose to invest specifically in companies that make this a priority. Asset managers all over the world also take their cues from large sovereign funds. So if we see a trend of large sovereign funds investing in companies that take gender diversity very seriously, then we could see this becoming more of a wider trend. As part of this year's report, we wanted to make sure that we also get the views of central bankers and investment professionals who are working in sovereign funds and pension funds. So the report that you should have now also features some write-ups from these individuals. And in their write-ups, we asked them why diversity matters to their institutions and what are they doing in order to make sure that more women are able to progress in their careers. Here are some examples. So Sylvie Collard, Deputy Governor of Banque de France, said that they are implementing equality leadership training courses to challenge stereotyping and develop self-confidence among their staff. We also asked Banco de Portugal, and Ana Paula Serra, a board director of the central bank, said that they promote flexible working arrangements, including the option to work remotely, which is something that mothers and other parents can take advantage of. We also asked Ed Sibley of the Central Bank of Ireland, and he talked about how they as a central bank are asking banks that they're supervising to submit plans on how they plan to address shortcomings on gender diversity. We also asked a pension fund, so we asked AP2 of Sweden about their female representation index, which measures the percentage of women on boards and executive management. So this index aims to kind of contribute to how different companies are looking at places to invest and how diversity can factor into that decision making. So these are just some of the measures that different organizations are taking. We hope that as part of today's discussion, you can talk about this, participate, and discuss with our panelists, who I'm sure have different points of view to contribute. I'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for listening and have a good discussion.